Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is my very pleasure to open this event. My name is Asria Fataki. I will be the moderator for this session. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on your time zone. Welcome to the Africa Renewable Energy Dialogue that is co-hosted today by the UN high-level champion and IRENA. So few housekeeping points here before we start. So this event will be simultaneously translated both in French and Portuguese. So myself and all the speakers will speak in English, but the translation will be available in both English and Portuguese. They will also be recorded in both those languages, and the recordings will be available in English, French, and Portuguese on the IRENA website right after the discussion. So please don't be shy and share your question if you might have some for our panelists, because we have the chance to have many great and high-level panelists today. So if you have questions, please don't be shy. Share them on the Q&A section, not on the chat, please, so that we can really process them as they come. Unfortunately, we probably won't have the time to address them all, but please feel free to ask your question. To the speakers, we have ahead of us, a session of 1.5 hours that I'm sure will be very rich of your contributions. Therefore, we have to be very cautious on timing. So please excuse me if I have to manage the time in a very strict way, but we really want everyone to contribute the most, based on each one intervention, of course. And finally, please, everyone, mute the speakers. You will be muted at the beginning of the session. Please sure to unmute when you need to start. And if you have any technical issue, please contact the IRENA IT team, and they will do their best to assist you, to support you. So when it comes to the structure of the meeting, we will have several different sessions today. And so to give you a little bit an idea of how things are going to happen, if I can say so, the idea is to have very different sections with different thematic, but on each of them, we will try to have very interactive and lively discussions so that it can be as profitable as possible for our audience that is very diverse. We had more than 400 registrations today, so please feel free to keep this seminar as live and interactive as possible. We will have about, a time that is attributed to each speaker. So please be there, please stay with us, stay involved, and without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Nigel Topping, the COP26 high-level champion, for the opening words for this seminar. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you so much, Astria, and thank you to IRENA and also to the African Climate Fund, to Dalberg and to UNECA for helping host this dialogue. As per instructions, I'll keep my remarks short because we've got a lot of great speakers to get through. The role I have is a mandate from the UN climate process. The parties decided in Paris that this role of high-level champion would be created to work with non-state actors, the private sector, civil society, local governments, and we worked through a very big collaboration of partners we call the Marrakesh Partnership. It was founded in Morocco in COP22. And of course, we're very focused on COP26, which is less than 100 days away, but my role will continue until COP27, which will be in Africa next year. We don't formally know where it'll be. We have some strong indications. So I'm particularly looking forward to learning more about Africa today, with the view to working very closely with an African partner next year. As part of this Marrakesh partnership, we've published now 3 generations of climate action pathways. The energy pathway has been led by IRENA, and they break down the task of getting to zero by time and by actor. So what does the finance sector need to do? What do governments need to do? What does civil society need to do? What does the private sector need to do on the supply and the demand side? So I'm really keen to get into the dialogue today on the topic of Africa's energy pathway. So far, we've just done global pathways, but we'll get into regional pathways next year. So there'll be a lot for me to learn today, because of course every continent has its unique context and perspectives, and the ultimate 1.5 degree aligned pathways will have to respond to regional needs and priorities. We know that we're going to need a paradigm shift on energy services around the world, moving towards different sources of energy and different structures of supply, with much more of a hybrid of centralized and decentralized, which will offer a great opportunity to those countries that still have sizable off-grid populations to take their own development pathway to build more resilient decentralized energy systems that this century is going to see. And we also, I've just been in America with a colleague who's never been to New York before, and who was shocked to find that New York doesn't have as sophisticated mobile money as Nairobi. In fact, so I think something worth remembering, but in such a young continent, that there's real opportunities for leapfrogging. And I think, what we've seen with M-Pesa and other fintech developments in Africa could show the way to a renewably fueled, more efficient, healthy and cost-effective development model. I'm delighted that we're going to hear from James Mwangi, who's going to share the analysis which he's done at Dalberg very generously to help us understand the both positive and useful pointers to different pathways to 1.5 degree future in Africa. And I think crucially, the analysis focuses not just on emissions reduction, but also on universal energy access. It's clear that those two have to go hand in hand. Also, I think really important for us, given our role is to work very much with private sector and local government, to look at the relationship between private sector and government, what Gonzalo Munoz, my fellow high-level champion from Chile, called the ambition loop. And I'm particularly aware that this is a crucial agenda for the millions of young and talented people across the continent. For those of, I just checked the stats. The median age in Europe is 42.5 years. So at 55, I'm only 12 years over the median age. The median age in the continent of Africa is 19.7 years. So that's a huge difference, right? So it means that the role of young people is even more important in a young continent to drive the investment in renewable energy and the much needed jobs for those resilient livelihoods. And I know that we're going to hear from the government of Malawi to talk a bit about that nexus of jobs and livelihoods. We're also going to hear that there's a real need for bankable demand in renewable energy in Africa. And I want to thank those from the investor and the philanthropic community and governments, such as AUDA, NEPAD, for sharing their deep experience and thinking about how to get renewable energy to the last mile in Africa. And I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from government energy ministries about what they have already achieved. It's interesting to see that some of the smaller economies in Africa are leading the way. I know that Cape Verde is making major shifts toward a low carbon economy and is going to get on-grid or off-grid power supply across all 9 islands to consumers within the next 2 years. It's really impressive. And also, I think we shouldn't forget that over half of the citizens of the African continent still don't have affordable, reliable and clean energy, and that many of them, and again, James, maybe we'll touch on this. James, I've just been looking at some of your headline figures, still relying on charcoal and wood to cook on, with all of the challenges that represents, and therefore the opportunity that represents. So, Astrid, I'll wrap up there. Really looking forward to hearing from many experts and to learning a lot about what's already being done and what remains to be done to get renewable energy on and off grid to the last mile to everyone in Africa. Thanks, Astrid.
Thank you so much, Nigel. So you mentioned it, the role, the importance of young people in the future of Africa. And of course, the role of their involvement in terms of livelihood on the continent. We'll start our next session by hearing from speakers who will speak each for 5 minutes on why, and most importantly, how renewable energy is key to create a driven economic growth on the continent. So I will hand over to Jean-Paul Adam, who's Director of Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resources Management at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Over to you, Adam. Jean-Paul.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Addis Ababa. First of all, I'm very pleased as the representative of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to be joining with IRENA, Dalberg, ECA, the African Climate Foundation, to have this, I think, very important conversation, which is really about how renewable energy is critical for a green recovery to COVID-19 and building the economy of the future for Africa. I absolutely, following on from what Nigel said, there is an opportunity for Africa to leapfrog, but it is not a given. It is something which has to be planned and delivered in a very considered manner. So I have a very few slides, which I think will help to illustrate the points that I'm making. And if we could kindly have the team to put them on screen, and I will speak to those. Thank you. So first of all, we need to look at why Africa is currently off track. We can go to the second slide. Why Africa is currently off track in relation to achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7. And the first problem is a very limited electricity supply. And particularly in the rural economies, there is a domination of biomass, which also then leads to other issues around, for example, deforestation. And we can note that this further leads to, for example, the degradation of land to be used for agriculture, the degradation of land also which contributes towards water facilities, and therefore overall is critical for people's livelihoods and for them to live a decent life. And there is also insufficient generation across the continent, and that means that overall 600 million people do not have access to electricity, and as critically 900 million with no access to clean cooking. And in the context of different countries, there are 24 countries that have electricity access rates of less than 50%. A number of countries, particularly in the context of COVID-19, have actually had a reversal in electricity access, meaning that there are less people that have access than before. And there are 3 countries in particular that have huge electricity deficits that we need to address. We can go to the next slide. So the main issue here is to flag that Africa, because of its particularly low generation, needs to invest more and needs to particularly address the issue of base generation to be able to factor in the ability to bring in more renewables. And that base generation, unfortunately, because of the lack of battery technology, will probably have to also include investment, at least in the first phase, as part of the transition in some fossil fuel-based generation, such as through natural gas. On the plus side, investing in energy is really the platform that leads to improved livelihoods. And if we're going to talk about a sustainable value chain in Africa, it starts with energy. So the Economic Commission for Africa earlier this year released a report called Building Forward for an African Green Recovery. And we've looked at a number of case studies, which in the first launch of the report included the DRC and the Republic of South Africa. We have subsequently added Kenya and Egypt. And this report has shown that there is a very dramatically better return on investment in terms of jobs and gross value added in green sectors. And this is building on energy as the platform for sustainable infrastructure, which then allows, for example, investment in climate smart agriculture and is also associated with the implementation of nature-based solutions. But if we look at those investments compared to investments that would have been done in a traditional fossil fuel-based economy, we can see that in Kenya, in terms of gross value added, you get 200% return of investment compared to fossil fuels. And in terms of green jobs, there's 120% return. In Egypt, you have 150% return in terms of value added and 55% return in terms of jobs. In DRC, you have 280% return in terms of value added, and 130% return in jobs. And in South Africa, you have the largest impact, where you have a 420% return on value added and 250% return in jobs. Next slide, please. And the next element that I want to touch on as a takeaway in particular, in terms of where we need to focus our efforts, is that Africa has a huge spending gap in terms of investing in a green recovery, because it doesn't have the same access to resources. And we can see from this slide that in terms of recovery spending, which is slightly different as opposed to rescue spending is spending that goes immediately in towards supporting people in their immediate needs, whereas recovery spending is about investment in future infrastructure. And Africa has not had access to finance to be able to do this in the same way. And the largest recovery plans in Africa are still below 1% of their GDP, and that's Egypt and South Africa. And there are a number of African countries, and we've modeled, for example, the DRC, and unfortunately, we couldn't even feature it on the graph because the spending corresponds to $10 per citizen. And as opposed to countries in the developed world, which are spending well in excess of 10% of GDP. And this goes directly to the ability to raise resources. And we can go to the next slide. And the ability to raise resources is because that's where it's at the point of investment at the start when you need to make the change and the transition towards sustainable infrastructure that the need is felt the most. And in terms of the modeling that ECA has done, we've also shown that if we were able to do recovery spending to the level of about 100 billion in 2020, we actually would have gained 5.4 percentage points in terms of GDP growth. So by delaying this, the spending at that level until 2021 or even beyond, because as yet this financing is not yet secured, and even the conversation around the SDRs is still a conversation, this money is still not yet released to African countries, then we're talking about very significant losses in terms of growth, and therefore the risk as well of a missed opportunity. So the final point is that investing in energy, first and foremost and upfront, creates huge value addition opportunities throughout the economies. And the sooner we do it, the bigger impact it will have. Thank you very much, and back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So now we are going to move on with Samir Ibrahim, who is the co-founder and CEO of Sun Culture. Samir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me for this very important conversation. I think everyone on this call agrees that climate change is the biggest threat to humanity at large, not only because it threatens our home, but also because it's an amplifier to our biggest problems. And climate change is unforgiving. It's disproportionately affecting the lowest contributors to climate change, which happen to be the world's most vulnerable people, small farmers in emerging markets. And while often the global north continues to burn fossil fuels, we sometimes forget that in order to grow enough food for us to eat in the next 30 years, we will rely on these small farmers in emerging markets who are facing droughts, floods, locusts, and lower producing land due to climate change. So today I've been asked to set the scene on how we can use distributed renewable energy to create climate resilience for this very, very large group of people. So every day, this is the cycle that plays in my head. Small farmers make money by selling crops, selling animals, or selling byproducts of animals. All three of these things require water. Farmers get water from the rain. Climate change is making the already unpredictable and unreliable rains more unpredictable and more unreliable, pushing them further into poverty. So what do? One option is they cut down forests to make charcoal to sell, which is a major contributor to Africa losing 10 million acres of natural forests every year, which is an area 700 times the size of Manhattan, just because Nigel mentioned Manhattan earlier. Another option is that they move to big cities in search of better jobs, which is also called mass urbanization or climate migration. And this creates slums and threatens security. I mean, in the past decade, several countries have experienced regime change to armed conflict due in part to food-related unrest. So Haiti, Madagascar, Egypt, Syria, etc. So I view this today in the middle of climate change, food security, and And what we're talking about today is not just about creating resilience for small farmers, but it's about reducing climate migration, increasing national security, saving our forests, saving Africa from spending $100 billion importing food, and growing enough food to feed the world. So the big question is, how do we do that? Because farmers make money growing food or keeping animals, and access to reliable water is the biggest hindrance to this growth, we first started by focusing on using distributed renewable energy to move water, or solar irrigation. Our solution is a solar-powered water pumping and irrigation system that lets farmers transition from depending on low-value rain-fed crops that they harvest only when the weather cooperates to farming high-value crops year-round. And over time, our farmers have seen an increase in their incomes of 5 to 10 times while upgrading their home to enjoy modern appliances like lighting and phone charging and TVs and all the stuff that you and I enjoy. Our systems include battery storage, so our customers can use these features day or night. And we finance our customers on what we call a pay-as-you-grow plan that lets farmers pay in small monthly installments over several months. And we provide everything from installation to training to after-sales support. But the most important part about all of this is that we're at a really unique point in time right now. We finally have enough data to start making very non-emotional cases for distributed energy for agriculture. Last June to September, which was arguably the worst period of time for Kenyan farmers in generations, 90% of Kenyan farmers lost money, while almost 90% of farmers working with sun culture earned money. And 95% of our farmers reported improving their quality of life. So we have data that these types of solutions are working. But in order to reach our food security and climate resilience goals, and this is from an ecosystem perspective, not a sun scale, is affordability. While the price of solar irrigation has dropped by 90% since we started, and we finance our customers, most farmers are still priced out of these types of solutions. And throughout history, incentives like subsidies have been used to help scale the uptake of agriculture and electrification products. And we need to take this same tried and tested approach with solutions working at this agriculture energy nexus, because a relatively little bit amount of money goes a super long way here. There's a non-linear correlation between reducing the price of distributed renewable energy products and the addressable market. Very quick example is if we reduce the cost of our system by 15%, 1-5, we increase our addressable market in Kenya by 100%. So what I urge everyone on this call to do is think about where along the cost buildup of distributed renewable energy products can we reduce costs? Is it end user subsidies? Is it lowering the cost of capital? Whatever the solution, the result needs to be more technology to farmers fast. So thank you, and I'll pass the mic over to Pasi Amayo, who is the SDG 7 focal point for East and Southern Africa, who will provide a youth perspective on why renewable energy is important to young people's lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samir, and for that insight. I'll quickly jump in and let everybody know that powering Africa often means lighting up homes and industries. However, in my opinion, it is more than just this. It covers all the energy needs from cooking to heating. And in this technological era where the youth are dominantly engaged in charging and powering electronic and electrical devices and gadgets and equipment, both in rural and urban area, what this means is energy is the bloodstream of the society. And as previously mentioned, the young people constitute a large majority of the population in Africa. At the SDG 7 Youth Constituency, which is a platform for young people to channel their actions and voices in the energy sector, we provide a platform for young professionals in the energy sector to contribute to the achievement of SDG 7. And one of our projects within the SDG 7 Youth Constituency is the Youth Sustainable Energy Hub, which features 98 youth energy projects, including some incredible youth-led renewable energy projects and businesses in Africa. But majority of these projects need to be properly and sufficiently supported and funded to enable them to continue delivering energy access, enabling the energy transition, and achieving sustainable energy for all. Let me take a pause at this point and share with you a story about a boy who harnessed water in Kenya. And this is a young man called John Magiro, who single-handedly, of his own resources, embarked in building an independent hydropower plant to enable his village to have lighting, to enable his peers to have access to electricity, to support their education, and to also enable their mothers and sisters and community to be able to cook with electricity at a cheap point. There is a lot of things that young people who are supported in the energy sector can achieve to address their access to affordable energy at the grassroots level. Finally, let me bring back to our attention that we have still 6 million people in Africa that don't have access to electricity. Yet reliable and affordable power is an important component for young people who must now work and study from home. Sadly, millions of young people cannot use their laptops or other digital devices due to unreliable and unaffordable power, forcing many of them to seek alternative sources for charging their devices at very expensive rates. Many have been frustrated as a reliable electricity connection allows people, especially young people, to ensure that their days are well used and that they can manage the transition to digital learning and working spaces given the pandemic. Renewable solutions have offered an alternative for these devastating situations that now young people across different parts of Africa, especially in rural areas, have had to live and manage during these hard times. It is then our opinion that if renewable solutions, especially distributed ones that can reach locations where the grid does not reach, can be supported, can be financed, and can be enabled both from a private sector participation, but also from a government policy perspective, many of our young people will have access to the opportunities that their peers in other continents have that they do not have, and in so they will be able to achieve the dreams that they all envision to have to change, to make the continent a better place. I want to conclude by saying that it is not enough for us to think of renewable energy as an industrial and economic tool. We must also think about renewable energy as a transformative resource that can make local communities and economies more vibrant, local ecosystems more resilient, and local people, including the young people, more secure in the continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pasi. Thank you to all of you, Jean-Paul and Samir. I think this session was your interventions were very complementary, if I can say so. You know, and I keep in mind this idea of working as an ecosystem, you know, to address those issues of renewable energy, especially in this lens of using it as a transformative tool for creating young opportunities, job opportunities for young people in Africa. Thank you very much. So now I would like to take you to the Pan-African continental level, if I can say so, to hear the thinking behind the newly endorsed Africa Union's continental power systems master plan. We hope that we will hear about what are some of the challenges that the continental power system master plan will address. In order to do so, I am more than happy to welcome Crispin Zana from the IUDA NEPAD and Asimi Miketa, from IRENA. So we are going to start with Crispin. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Good. I have to apologize for my camera. I will have to take off my camera because if I put on camera, my Wi-Fi is a bit weak. So allow me to speak without my camera on. I think that is granted. Yeah. I would like to thank you very much for inviting AUDA NEPAD to this very exciting dialogue, where we know that it's a preparation towards the COP26. I would like to just highlight that AUDA NEPAD, AUDA NEPAD, is the technical arm of the African Union, which is meant to do the implementation of priority projects continentally and regionally, which at the present moment have been highlighted to be climate resilient. Talking about the continental master plan, we should refer back to one of the ministerial ministers of energy who came together in 2018 and 2019 and gave a request to AUDA NEPAD together with the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, the UN Economic Commission to Africa, and they say we need a continental master plan of the electricity generation as well as transmission, which can be used as a blueprint of the way forward for Africa. This means the 5 regional power pools, which is the northern region, the eastern region, the western region, the central region, and the southern region, will all be on one grid or one network, which will then be an answer to what the continent is aspiring to have, a single electricity market of all the member states. And that will also bring it to be one of the largest networks in the world. This will definitely answer some of our challenges by bringing in energy security, affordable energy. We will have sustainable electricity supplies, which will then support our dream of the African continental free trade, industrialization, and so forth. Let me share what the African Union Development Agency and partners are already doing up to date. What we have done so far is that brought in partners, the African Development Bank as a financing Pan-African organization, the European Union with their technical assistance facility, the World Bank, they're coming in to support this design of a continental network. And there are more partners to come in like USAID, the Islamic Development Bank, and so forth. Up to the end of 2020, we had already mapped out what is going on in terms of generation and electricity transmission. So, which means we are now having a baseline of the power pools. So the next step, which we have now already started, is training of power pools and stakeholders on modeling of the demand and supply. And we are having support from the IRENA, who will speak after me, as well as the International Atomic Agency based in Austria. Soon we'll be conducting specific support studies of renewables mainly, because we see renewables having a big potential in Africa. And this will cover solar energy, wind energy, bioenergy, geothermal, green hydrogen, battery storage systems, as well as hydro pump storage systems. This will then also address to see that the Continental Master Plan becomes our future guidance of how programs like the Program for Infrastructure Development can be planned, and with their inter-regional approach, the interdependence of the corridor approach, which brings in transport, ICT, water, and other sectors, including industry and agriculture. But what I want to highlight here is that the new approach of the corridor approach has a very strong emphasis on reaching the last mile. So we see now Auda NEPAD and other stakeholders are now working very strongly on the last mile connectivity, which brings in mini grids, making sure that everyone who is living in the corridors is not going to be left out. And this is going to be the biggest initiative in Africa, where we know that 60% of our population don't have electricity, and 60% of our population live in rural areas. And if they all go for renewable energy, which is our target, it means we have really helped to bring the continent to an energy resilient platform, which will contribute to the agenda of 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think with that, I have given you an indication of what this Continental Master Plan is all about and the challenges which we are addressing. I would like to hand over back to Astria so that IRENA can take over.
Thank you very much, Crispin. Indeed, I'm now inviting IRENA, represented by Asami Miketa, to move on.
Thank you very much, Astia. I hope you hear me. Thank you. I would like to focus my intervention on the importance of long-term planning. So regarding the question of Continental Master Plan, I am gonna build on what Crispin just stated. So the Continental Master Plan will allow to identify the priority investments that are aligned with the Africa's long-term vision. And it also promotes these investment options. And it also helps to identify the short-term actions that are needed to achieve the long-term goals. But the true benefit lies in the fact that this enables African countries to own and institutionalize the planning process, which we believe is a key enabler for investment. And Africa has huge renewable energy potential that are still to be fully deployed. Globally, deployment of renewable energy is ramping up very quickly. And according to IRENA's statistics, more than 80% of the new capacity added in 2020 was renewable energy. And compared with this global trend, the deployment of renewable energy in Africa is still a bit low pace, at least at the continental level. However, at the individual country level, we see some leading countries that are moving forward fast with the renewable energy deployment. And some of these countries now use non-hydro renewable energy from 15 to 40% in its electricity generation mix. And these countries are the ones that a proper policy framework is installed. And this shows that once a proper policy framework is installed, other African countries have potential to follow. So the long-term planning is one of the critical elements for enabling the investment. And IRENA has been supporting building and strengthening institutional energy planning capacity within the African governments. And from the dialogue that we have been having with African governments, development partners, and financiers, we think it is critical to have a good process for the long-term planning in place. And I would like to specifically highlight that process of planning is as important as plans per se, if not more important. So only good planning process makes good plans. And we may have many plans, but not all of them are built on good planning processes. So good planning processes require good planning governance that allows the use of transparent methodologies and built on comprehensive stakeholder consultations. And there should be a good planning structure across government institutions, having key master plan documents and subsector plans built on the master plan, including the plan for the distributed energy should be all aligned with the master plan. And ideally, the planning process is owned by the country, and this ownership allows to institutionalize the regular updates of the plans. And we can highlight several benefits of a good long-term plan. First, it creates or reflects consensus among stakeholders, thus making the plan robust and trustworthy as a true plan. And second, the short-term investment decision can be informed by the long-term vision. And that helps to avoid costly investment mistakes. And also it reduces uncertainties in policy directions and project selections, which is something that is often appreciated by investors. It also can send signals to investors on the type and quantity of investment need. And finally, having a trustworthy, robust, updated plan allowed to expedite the delivery of investment service by financiers, as otherwise the financiers require to start with studies to understand the market, which may introduce delay in the service delivery. So just to conclude my intervention, Continental Master Plan will not only identify the priority investment options, but also promote the good long-term planning practices in the continent and provide a platform for creating consensus for the long-term investment needs. And IRENA is very happy to be part of this process as the modeling partner, and we are happy to bring our expertise into the process. Thank you very much. I hand it over.
Thank you very much, Asami. I think we discussed during the first panel, the micro issues, and now both of you, Crispin and Asami, brought this more pan-continental, more micro point of view on the topic. But both of them have many issues in common, especially this vision on the long term. And we know that whilst much private and public capital is available for powering renewable energy on the continent, we yet have to see this translate into real gains in terms of financing renewable energy to the last mile, right? Within a 1.5 degree climate aligned trajectory. So in the next two sessions, we're going to explore this a bit more in detail. To start us off, I'm very delighted to welcome Mr. James Mwangi, who's the Executive Director of Dalberg Group, and who will present several 1.5 degree scenarios and take us through an evidence-based thought experiment, if I can say so, about what is possible and what is needed to get to the 100% renewable energy trajectories in Africa, including those which are capable of powering economic growth. So, James, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Astria, for shepherding the conversation. And thank you also to all of the other organizations, IRENA, UNECA, the High Level Champions Office, and the Africa Climate Foundation, all of whom have come together alongside us at Dalberg to host this dialogue. It's a real privilege to be a part of this conversation. At Dalberg, we seek to work towards an inclusive and sustainable world where all people everywhere can reach their full potential. And potential, I think, is key to really thinking about the renewable energy landscape and the pathways that stand in the future for Africa. What I'm going to present, as Astrid already pointed out, is a set of what ifs. We basically stepped back and working with the High Level Champions Office and building on conversations we'd had with the likes of UNECA and others, asked ourselves not just what is the current plan, but what might be possible if we really extended ourselves and looked at the energy transition for Africa, not just as an existential challenge, which it is, as we've discussed in terms of the climate impacts that lie ahead, but also the potential transformative opportunity. And so what we will go through in the next few slides is, in a sense, a summary of a summary. We drew from existing knowledge of trends, some of the updated projections, trends in technologies, assessments of potential, and summarize what might be possible. And from that, then a few slides summarizing that even further. So it's a summary of a summary, but hopefully a provocation as well in terms of thinking big. And so if we move to the first slide, we've already talked, other speakers have spoken eloquently about the dual challenge that we face. The first part of it is Africa is fundamentally energy poor. And that is a real limit on the ability of African citizens to realize their full potential and unlock dignified livelihoods for themselves. At the same time, the continent has low compared to the rest of the world, but growing emissions. We account for 6% of global emissions, 40% of that coming from our energy sector, and 18% of the growth over the next, between now and 2050 is projected to happen within Africa. At the same time, we have energy poverty and we have an emissions challenge. If you look at our current policies, we will miss the 1.5 degree emission scenario with over 700 million tons more emissions per year by 2040 than projected. At the same time, we don't quite get to our access goal. We will miss 100% access by 2040 using our current, if we stay on our current trajectory. And this is in spite of multiple investments and a range of efforts and plans currently in place. It's just that the gap is large and we need to think differently if we're to fully address it. If we flip to the next slide, what we then see is some of what we see as potential pathways for Africa's energy mix. On the far left is where we are today in 2018. We're generating just short of 1,000 terawatt hours per year and emitting about 1.2 gigatons of emissions per year. The stated policies, if you look at where our current trajectory, call it business as usual, will take us, will bring that number up to 1.9, just under 1.9 or 1,900 terawatt hours and just over 1.4 billion tons of emissions per year. That still is short of what we need in order to meet the energy access goals. Now, the IEA has a low carbon scenario, and this is what's shown in the middle picture there, where we say, we actually need about 2,739 terawatt hours to meet the continent's energy needs. And we project getting there in a low carbon scenario with about 1,625 or 1.6 gigatons of emissions. So an increase from where we are today. Now, we added 2 additional scenarios in our work and tried to model out what these could look like, just to understand what might be possible. The first, in all 3, we kept the amount of energy needed or our target amount of terawatt hours constant for the continent, in line with the IEA's low carbon scenario. And we asked, what might an energy composition look like that would keep emissions constant to 2018 levels? In other words, can we grow while keeping our emissions constant? And then further, what if we really pushed beyond the 1.5 degree scenario? What might that look like? Now, to be clear, we are not saying that this is necessarily immediately feasible just yet, but it is useful to understand what the possibilities might be if we adopted certain pathways and if we pursued them in greater detail and with greater rigor. If we go to the next slide, some interesting things become clear. Firstly, as we look at the three scenarios, in the IEA low carbon scenario, we have 100% access and lower emissions than current policies would lead to. We increase the amount of fossil fuel generation, indeed, to provide some of the baseload that we've talked about. And 41% of the continent's electricity is coming from fossil fuels by 2040. It does not quite meet the race to zero breakthroughs target of 60% renewables in the share. And there's a 34% increase in emissions by 2018. The levelized cost of electricity in that scenario is just about 0.073 cents per kilowatt hour. In the constant emissions scenario, we maintain the 2018 capacity of fossil fuels and nuclear. We may change their composition. In other words, some coal might become gas and so on and so forth. Renewables make up the gap to reach 100% access fully in the same proportion as in the IEA scenarios. And we exceed the race to zero breakthroughs target of 60% renewables with no change in emissions from 2018. Interestingly, the levelized cost of electricity goes lower. It's 0.071 cents per or dollars per kilowatt hour, or 7.1 cents per kilowatt hour. And similarly, we go one step further and reduce the high emission fossil fuels first. We provide flexibility for alternative sectors to meet emissions targets. And in our beyond 1.5 degree scenario, we actually end up with the lowest of the levelized cost of electricity. Interestingly, all of the beyond 1.5 degree scenario breaks even with the low carbon scenario after 13 years. In other words, by 2040, really pushing hard. Once we looked at the modeling, if you really push hard to do as much renewables as possible, you are in the money by 2040. And that gap only grows from there. In other words, the energy transition for Africa, in part because we have such a limited installed base of legacy energy sources, our primary challenges are financing, one, to ramp up our renewables sector. There's, of course, a range of complications behind those. I'll talk a little bit about some of these in the remaining slides, and we can certainly come back to this in offline and in Q&A. Next slide, please. So we highlighted what we saw as key outstanding challenges. And for us, challenges really, do also speak to opportunities. The first is around renewable energy, increasing the share of renewables as a proportion of the total energy capacity mix, in line with the need for emissions cuts. So how do we really nudge towards more renewables? That's clear. Of course, that for anyone who's looked at this for a long time, that goes hand in hand with the question of load balancing. Where is our base load coming from? How are we handling the intermittency of some of the renewable energy options, particularly as we wait for energy storage to really catch up in terms of cost? An important point for us on the continent to keep in mind is as we increasingly move to renewables, energy as a sector becomes less of a fuels-driven sector and more of a technology-driven sector, where you can see rapid improvements in the underlying technology and thus fundamental changes in the cost base at a predictable rate over time. So as we think about things like storage and so on and load balancing, we need to say we're looking at a snapshot in time, but in an evolving picture. The lack of user-centric last-mile solutions to provide electricity to remote households is another challenge that needs to be solved. This speaks to both the question of how do we lower the cost of energy access, as well as how do we make sure that through approaches such as focusing on productive use, we're making sure that consumers are actually able to translate this new energy access, which will have a cost, into increased incomes and improved livelihoods. Now, there's a paradox which the bankable demand speaks to. We all know that Africa is tremendously energy poor, and yet at the same time, we struggle to justify new investments in energy infrastructure out of a question of a lack of demand. And I think this speaks to the need for bankable demand. We know that there is untapped latent demand among the population, but how do we make it bankable and investable? And finally, somewhat different from the others, but a really big energy driver of Africa's emissions is cooking. And polluting cooking fuels, which continue to dominate, such as wood, charcoal, and kerosene. We now need to be thinking about, what are the alternatives to those, and that's another key area of challenge. Some of that will come off the grid in electricity, but we will need to think about other options along the same lines. Next slide. So we highlight 3 opportunities for action in the report, and I think that a link to the report has been shared in the chat for those of you wishing to take a look at it in greater detail and some of the analysis that underpins it. The first, which was, I think, very eloquently put forward by previous speakers, is we need to orient our policies towards a focus on a 1.5-degree scenario. And that's both because that's where the rest of the world is going, but also because, as we know, across the continent, Africa is facing some of the hardest impacts of a failure to adhere to a 1.5-degree scenario. So, it would be foolhardy to ignore that on one side and then have whatever gains we get from our energy system be lost in the impacts across our agriculture and other aspects of our livelihoods due to unchecked climate change. The second area of opportunity is really focusing on bankable energy demand from new technologies. And this is about saying, how do we change the energy equation that typically today saddles sovereign governments and their national utilities with the onerous demands of figuring out how to carry on their balance sheet the heavy cost of funding an energy transition? Are there other ways to unlock that through bankable opportunities in either transportation, various high energy use cases? Hydrogen is one that we'll talk about in a moment, among others. And then finally, as we think about this, we need to then think about what are the kinds of enterprises or innovations that we will need to accelerate and grow. You saw the example of Sun Culture earlier, and there are many similar businesses that are beginning to make an impact on the continent's climate footprint. How do we accelerate those more rapidly? So policy, bankable demand at scale, and then unlocking a generation of climate entrepreneurs that allow Africa to really step forward and play its role and do more than its fair share in terms of climate action, not as a tax on our growth, but really as a source of leapfrog growth and economic opportunity. One example of that, which I'll cover very briefly in the next slide, is unlocking bankable energy demand through the hydrogen industry. The basics of this are becoming increasingly widely understood. We can use renewable energy, of which the continent has a lot of potential, but which is difficult to unlock because there aren't bankable use cases, to generate hydrogen and oxygen for both industrial and other uses, which can then feed into industries, chemical storage, and mobility, and potentially for export. This is a space in which you're already seeing a lot of activity around the world, including in the global south with countries like Chile, Morocco, and others starting to make a real push as potential green hydrogen hubs of the future. And we've seen production costs fall something like 40% in the last 5 years, a growing market over $200 billion of market value by 2025, and the use of hydrogen could cut global emissions by almost 34%. Importantly, this is just one example of the ways that we can, by introducing or focusing on a new industry as a potential source of bankable demand, unlock the potential build out of renewable energy for the continent and allow us to pursue some of those ambitious scenarios that were laid out in the pathways. And so I will close by saying, just with an eye on time, on the last slide, that at the end of the day, the 1.5-degree pathway is both feasible and affordable. In many ways, it's a financing question, not an affordability question, in that it is financially more attractive to commit to more aggressive renewables-based options than it is to go with legacy energy sources. We need to develop these scenarios in greater detail in a way that works for the continent, and to view the energy transition not just as a challenge, but as an opportunity to truly leapfrog and establish Africa as a new energy leader rather than a late energy system follower. A true 1.5-degree pathway needs to include all sectors and all society in a holistic, system-wide transition to a just and low-carbon future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. So yes, Africa as a leader, not as a follower. You've raised many, many interesting points during this intervention, and we had many questions that maybe on the chat that maybe you will answer in writing later if you may. But before we jump into the next session, I would like to ask you a very quick question that maybe you can answer quickly. What are the questions in this space that you will be personally exploring over the next year, maybe as a follow-up of this study? If you still have 1 minute for it.
Oh, sorry, I had a problem with audio there. I lost you for a moment, Astria. Please reply.
I was just wondering what are the points and the questions that you will be exploring over the next year on this space as a follow-up of this study?
I think a critical one is moving from the potential that's identified. What we did was basically say, if you just take what we know about what's happening in the energy sector and what's happening across the continent, here are some of the things that are possible. I think we now need to drill down into saying, here is an actual potential plan for the continent, and what does this mean for particular countries? And part of that is really getting each of the countries of the continent to really understand what's the potential opportunity for them in a sub 1.5 degree scenario. And shifting from where we are now as a continent, I think, Astria, the dialogue globally has tended to say, the main action around climate action will sit in the global north and in some of the larger emerging economies. Africa will really be a victim of climate change and maybe will be exempted from some of the restrictions around how we grow our industry. If we can instead articulate a case for how Africa can accelerate the path for the rest of the world towards 1.5 degree future, that allows us to access the capital we need to transform our economies. It is an opportunity that will not last long, because over time, others will realize that committing to this 1.5 degree pathway is better for them. And the lead we have by being behind in fossilizing our energy sector will go away as others pass us. So there is a short window over the next year or two to articulate a case for investment in African clean energy and these more aggressive pathways. We need to start translating into specific cases and specific propositions, and start doing the feasibility work that will highlight the degree to which Africa is actually a preferred destination for some of these opportunities. I hope that answers the question.
Perfectly. Thank you very much, James. So going from the study to the concrete action plan, to a concrete action plan. And that's precisely what we are going to discuss during this last session, if I can say so, the facilitated dialogue that we're going to have, because you mentioned it, James, that financing and raising capital is absolutely key. It's the main bottleneck to this green transition on the continent. And we know now that both countries and companies and the private sector are still struggling to raise the level of capital and investment needed in Africa to transform economies and to take advantage of the forthcoming green dividend. So what needs to change to make this happen? The Dalberg report made some very interesting recommendation, which will be explored during this final session. So I'm very delighted to welcome several representatives from government, but also investors to discuss those points in a very dynamic way, so that we can really have the perspective from both sides, because that's, as you already mentioned, an ecosystem problematic that needs to be addressed at this level. So I would like to start the discussion with Mr. Sifo Bilat, who's the Development Planning Manager for the National Planning Commission of Malawi.
I think you are muted, Astria.
Sorry. So, Mr. Bilat, as part of your role at the National Planning Commission in Malawi, can you speak to what prompted Malawi to accelerate their renewable energy strategy?
Yes, thank you very much, Astria, and thank you for the opportunity that we can come in to talk about renewable energy efforts in Malawi. I just want to come up with a small introduction that we, as National Planning Commission, our job is to come up with the plans, long-term and medium-term plans, and that we can thereafter foresee the implementation of these plans. And this year in January, we have come up with the national vision that we are calling Malawi 2063. As a vision, we wanted to make sure that as a country, we are self-reliant, but also we are attaining inclusive wealth creation, trying to target the poor as well, so that our development is inclusive. In this vision, we have several pillars, and one of which is industrialization, but also we have urbanization and agriculture commercialization. We have considered how do we get to achieve these pillars in the next few decades by concentrating on what we are calling enablers. And these enablers include energy. In Malawi, around 12% of the population access energy as in electricity. So majority of Malawians are in the biomass, and we just need to do something to make sure that more people access clean energy. Now, while much of our energy is already renewable energy, we don't seem to have much opportunities that we can migrate to any other, but we just have to promote the renewable energy development. And in this case, it means that we just need to put in interventions that will promote the renewable energy production. At the moment, we have what we're calling a 10-year implementation plan of the Vision 2063 that we have. And in this plan, we are promoting renewable energy in order for it to facilitate or accelerate the interventions in the decade of action, as we are achieving the SDGs by 2030. But also at national level, our target is that we should become a middle income economy. So we know as we are pursuing the SDGs in the decade of action, but we're also making sure that everything falls in place and that we're going to become better by 2030. And what has prompted us to go the promotion of renewable energy, first of all, is that already access is not good enough. We need access at national level, but also local level. And we are promoting off-grid energy production so that we can even reach out to those that are away from the national grid, and that we can make an impact on the proposal we have made on the secondary cities. But also to mention that Malawi is one of the countries that have been very much hit by the impacts of climate change. And this is going to help us diversify the sources of energy. Now, it means we have to move from hydro to wind energy or solar energy, wherever it's going to work. We understand that it's expensive, but it is worth it, especially as we are implementing the nationally determined contribution interventions that we put for ourselves. We didn't have to follow this. While we are in need of producing more of energy, we could use any other source, including coal. But probably in the efforts to have green growth and green energy, we have to just promote the renewable energy production. But also, you just have, we can also think about the vulnerabilities that come with the infrastructure destruction because of weather-related events and so on, and diversity is just necessary. So in this case, we are looking at efforts to make sure that we are together with everyone else as we are approaching the 1.5 degrees target by making sure that we are mitigating the impacts of climate change, but at the same time we are adapting. So renewable energy sources will help us as a country to recover without impacting negatively on the livelihoods of Malawians, but also reaching out to the poor rural farmers that we are trying to target so that they're increasing their incomes, but also their food secure in the advent of adverse climate change impacts. So I think that's largely why we are looking at this, taking also note the fact that Malawi is still agroeconomy. You know, largely our populations rely on agriculture and natural resource use. And if we are not very careful in managing and mitigating effects of climate change through various ways, including the use of renewable energy sources, it's going to be very impactful on the livelihood of our people. We have to protect them by doing the right thing. In the next 10 years, as we're implementing the NDC, we have to make sure as much as possible that we're using our resources sustainably and that we are able to reach out to everyone with all the efforts, and that we can even provide services that are necessary through distributing energy to everyone. And we have programs, various programs that we are putting in place to make sure that we are reaching out to all people and that they can access the good healthy services, education, as well as farm extension services, so that they're able to earn an income, but also be able to receive social service. Maybe let me stop there unless there's another critical question. I'm trying to be within the 3 minutes. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Bilat. So now I would like to hand over to Hela Shekruhu, who's the chairman and CEO of Nithyo Holdings. Hela, you are an experienced leader, previously the Minister of Energy in Tunisia, and now the founder of Nithyo Holdings, which invest in finance instrument behind off-grid renewable project and technologies. Tell us how you do it and what is the role of the policymaker in facilitating the growth of distributed renewable energies solutions.
Thank you, Astria. I'm truly honored to contribute to this excellent discussion, especially given my work for the more than 15 years in building the financial infrastructure to mobilize and channel billions of dollars in climate finance to developing countries, especially in Africa, at the African Development Bank, at the United Nations Green Climate Fund, and now at Nithyo. So Nithyo is a data-driven investment platform focused on enabling universal renewable electrification in Africa. We do so by removing a key bottleneck from the distribution of renewable energy in our countries, including to the base of pyramid communities, namely a deep understanding of the relative ability to pay by the end users for the energies, products, and services they receive. As you know, very few energy distributors are profitable in Africa, and the key market failure is the limited ability to forecast and proactively manage the future energy payments by the end users. This also makes it harder for distributors to raise funding at scale, given that a main asset of theirs, the future payments from end users, is difficult to assess and put a dollar value on. So it can serve as a basis for raising funding that fuels their growth. Sharp growth in renewable distribution is essential not only for mitigation, but also for adaptation to the harsh impacts of climate change, including on agrarian economies. The Nithyo platform combines high-quality granular geospatial data that are predictive of the relative ability to pay by end users, and we include in there socioeconomic and environmental data. And our algorithms allow us to have reliable forecasts of future cash flows on energy services. This is particularly effective when targeting rural communities whose ability to pay derives from a combination of climate and environmental factors, such as relative aridity, access to water resources, as well as socioeconomic factors. This allows us now to pool standardized future cash flows and use them to raise blended financing that combines catalytic sources of capital with risk capital from large institutional investors. We are backed by TPG, which is a global leader in asset management, that is funded by US institutional investors. And in a nutshell, we are building a pipeline through which institutional funding can flow at scale to renewable distribution for all Africans, including rural and base of the pyramid communities. And when it comes to the essential role of policymakers, we observe that they could accelerate the deployment of renewables by supporting three core areas of action. Number one, as mentioned previously, electrification master plans. It's very important to migrate to integrated electrification master plans, which are clearly articulating realistic scenarios for the growth of the grid compared to the enabling of development of mini grids that do not require the main grid to reach at community level and standalone off-grid systems. This, the more realistic and time-bound phasing of that development, the more likely you are to attract investors, both local investors and international investors, because you give them the comfort and visibility based on a credible master plan that uses realistic timelines and allows for different technologies for different end users and communities. So grid for urban, mini grids, and off-grid for smaller urban centers and rural areas. Number two, systematically adopt regulations that remove bottlenecks for the bankable renewable energy distribution. This includes three areas. One, make sure that all things being equal, you systematically have a more favorable taxation for renewable energy distribution compared to fossil fuels. It seems obvious, but as a former policymaker in my own country in North Africa, there is always need to make sure that it is ingrained in law, decree, regulation, and practice. This includes energy efficient appliances that are needed to create and nurture the bankable demand by the end users for productive use and for home use. Number two, open up to mobile money. Mobile money is extremely important to ease the payment and collection for the distributors of renewable energy, including for the very large unbanked and remote communities. Number three, make sure that you keep it easy and simple to establish and grow a renewable distribution company. Make sure your regulatory environment stays light touch and simple so that you're not hindering the rollout of these fast to deploy distributed renewable energy systems. Finally, policymakers generally, but in particular when you are looking at developing your energy sector, it's important to note that local savings and liquidity are typically insufficient to meet our infrastructure needs. So you want your country to be attractive to foreign direct investments. This requires that the monetary policies are favoring the ease of access to foreign currency conversion and the relative stability of your local currency towards foreign currency investments. So with those three key areas of action by policymakers, you make the recipe for bankable and fast growth of renewable energy distribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella, for this very comprehensive approach. It's frustrating. I would like to comment on everything, but we have to move on to the next speaker. And I'm going to switch in French here to welcome the Director of Renewable Energy of Burkina Faso. Donc, nous allons maintenant passer à notre prochain speaker, qui est Monsieur Isaka Nogo, le directeur des énergies renouvelables, de la direction des énergies renouvelables du ministère de l'énergie du Burkina Faso. Monsieur le directeur, une question que j'aimerais vous poser, c'est aujourd'hui le Burkina Faso a une stratégie très ambitieuse d'accélération de la pénétration des énergies renouvelables au niveau du pays. Je pense qu'il y a un agenda à l'horizon 2030. Quels sont les principaux points, d'après vous, qui vraiment vont permettre de rendre cette stratégie et son implémentation possible et surtout voilà, d'atteindre les objectifs qui ont été visés par le gouvernement?
Okay, merci bien à tous. Il faut dire que le gouvernement de Burkina Faso, donc, pour atteindre les objectifs donc, liés donc, au changement climatique et également donc, satisfaire donc, les trilèmes énergétiques qui est d'assurer l'accès aux services énergétiques au moindre coût. Donc, c'est engagé donc, dans une transition énergétique. Et cette transition énergétique vise donc à permettre donc, au secteur privé donc, de mieux contribuer donc, au développement donc, du secteur. À ce titre, donc, on a fait donc, la réforme liée donc, au secteur de l'énergie qui permet donc l'intervention donc, du secteur privé, aussi bien dans la production d'électricité qui, à ce jour, on a déjà signé avec les partenaires privés pour 200 MW solaires. Et également, donc, on a 300 MW donc, qui est en cours donc, de préparation et qui doit être signé avant donc, à la fin 2022. Donc, ces projets donc, sont associés donc, le projet donc, d'électrification rurale, et notamment donc, avec l'appui des partenaires techniques et financiers tels que la Banque mondiale et la BAD, ainsi que l'AFD et l'Union européenne. Donc, nous avons donc en charge donc, de promouvoir donc, le secteur privé dans l'électrification rurale. À ce titre, il y a eu des réformes adaptées donc, pour l'électrification rurale. Également, donc, il a été nécessaire de mettre en place un mécanisme de financement innovant qui couple donc, la subvention donc, et des crédits donc, aux différents opérateurs donc, privés. Et ce type d'investissement a permis donc, de faire une réforme donc, de la tarification qui est applicable donc, au niveau national et rural. Et également donc, en mettant en place également des mécanismes pour leur permettre donc, de pouvoir donc, satisfaire donc, à leur donc, recouvrement donc, et rentabiliser un peu leurs investissements. À ce type de projet, s'associe la distribution donc, des kits solaires individuels qui permet aussi à une grande partie donc, de la population d'avoir accès donc, à ces services énergétiques durables et à moindre coût. Donc, il faut dire que dans tous ces mécanismes, il y a le système donc, de contrôle qualité donc, des différents équipements qui sont mis en place pour pouvoir satisfaire donc, la demande énergétique. Il faut dire aussi que l'esprit innovant qui a prévalu également est que l'État même a fait des projets pilotes en mettant en place donc, des kits solaires adaptés pour différentes couches sociales qui va donc comme l'équivalent de 3 ampères jusqu'à 20 ampères monophasés, et que la Société nationale de l'électricité va bientôt mettre en place un guichet privé solaire donc pour permettre à tous ceux qui veulent les énergies renouvelables, notamment du solaire, puissent pouvoir, à travers la Société nationale, qui va homologuer des entreprises donc privées. Il faut dire que ce n'est pas eux qui vont faire les installations, ils vont homologuer des entreprises privées qui vont travailler avec eux pour pouvoir donc faire des fee-for-service pour les populations burkinabées. Aussi un peu les grandes actions donc, en termes d'innovation qui sont en cours au Burkina Faso. Et pour donc, mailler tout cela, il faut dire que les opérateurs privés bénéficiaires sont au niveau donc, des investissements. Il y a les exonérations donc, au niveau des équipements. Et ces exonérations donc, ont été constatées depuis donc, 2013. Donc, et ces exonérations portent sur les droits de douane et ainsi que donc, la TVA au niveau donc, de l'importation du matériel solaire. Sans oublier que pour ceux qui veulent investir, aussi bien dans la production ou dans la production-distribution, c'est-à-dire les mini-réseaux verts, il y a ce que nous appelons donc le coût des investissements qui sont applicables donc, à ces investisseurs-là. Et ces investisseurs bénéficient beaucoup d'avantages fiscaux et douaniers, notamment donc, à l'investissement ainsi qu'à l'exploitation. Il faut dire que dans le coût des investissements, l'innovation qui a été faite par l'État burkinabé est qu'ils ont 2 années supplémentaires par rapport donc, à d'autres types d'investissements donc, liés donc, au développement donc, du Burkina Faso. Donc, voilà ce que je peux dire donc, en ce qui concerne donc, le secteur de l'énergie et les ambitions donc, du gouvernement donc, pour atteindre. sans beaucoup tarder donc sur ce que les autres ont insisté, les outils de planification stratégique qui ont été mis en place donc par l'État burkinabé, et que même il y a le système d'information géographique applicable à l'électrification rurale qui a été mis en place avec l'appui donc de l'Union européenne. Merci bien, madame.
Merci infiniment, Monsieur le Directeur. A very important and interesting point here about the legal and also tax incitation for investment in order to support the Burkina Faso national ambition in terms of renewable energies. So now we are going to switch back to the private sector, if I can say so, with Mr. Joseph Nganga, who's the Executive Director for Power and Climate Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. So Joseph, the Rockefeller Foundation is focusing on investing at the country level on distributed solar energy to the last mile in 5 countries in Africa. So can you tell us more about those countries, and also what are the essential sector and partners that you see as key in order to implement this strategy? And finally, how can the Rockefeller Foundation avoid crowding the private sector investment in renewable energy in some of those countries? A lot of questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Astria, and delighted to be here. Very interesting inputs from all the participants. And I'm very happy that with this level of engagement and contribution from the diverse groups, we have no choice but to solve the challenge, because we have all the solutions amongst us. As far as the foundation is concerned, let me step back and do a bit of a framing of how we are looking at this space. So the foundation, following COVID, has determined that in order to support emerging countries succeed in their recovery from COVID, but in a way that leads to a sustainable future that also improves people's livelihoods in the long term, we are going to invest substantially in ending energy poverty. And so we are in the process of setting up a new entity, and the foundation is contributing $500 million. IKEA Foundation has joined us in this new entity, and we have formed partnerships to address this challenge. $1 billion sounds like a lot of money, but in reality, in this sector, it's still a significantly low amount of money. So we look at our role as being able to catalyze the investment of other players from the private sector and so on by taking higher risks and charting paths and demonstrating models that can unlock large-scale distributed renewables. To address your questions, on the continent, we are keen to work with all the countries in Africa because they all have similar challenges, but we have prioritized 5 of them, which include Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Malawi. We are looking at those countries from 3 aspects. The first one is supply. How much power is currently available to the grid, and how much of it should be coming from mini grids, from solar home systems, and so on. So partnering with governments, with private sector, with development agencies, consultants, technical experts, and so on, to really understand each country and its current situation. We strongly believe that every country is different, and every country has its own resources and its own path to universal electrification. And so we are very conscious about partnering with the countries to develop solutions that are really aligned with them. You generate that power, and then what do you do with it? The challenge with extended electrification is that as soon as you get people power, if they're not using substantial amounts of it, they're not improving their incomes, and the utilities do not have the economics to continue operating optimally. So whether those utilities are mini grids, solar home system operators, or the national utilities, in the absence of bankable demand, as Mwangi from Dalberg called it, the electrification plans will not succeed. And so we spend a lot of time trying to understand what are the bankable demand interventions we can support. Hydrogen is an interesting one. We're also looking at agriculture, we're looking at e-mobility, and we're looking at even more advanced data centers, AI, and so on, to understand where there is bankable demand that could then serve as a client, a consumer of this power, thus enhancing the success of the efforts towards electrification. And finally, I'll conclude by saying that I am delighted to see the Dalberg report, because one of our goals is to achieve 1 billion reduction in 1 billion tons of CO2. And so looking at energy access and looking at it as a low cost, but also low carbon path to electrification, for us is at the core of what we're looking to achieve. So we are delighted to be here, and I'm very happy that we have such wonderful participants who are committed to partnering with us to achieve our joint ambitions. Thank you, Astria.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this comprehensive intervention. And indeed, all countries are relevant, but it's important to focus. So we now reach half of the panel. So since we still have very interesting panelists, we are going to extend our session of 20 more minutes. So please bear with us. And we would like now to move on to back to the public sector with Mr. Rito Evora, who's the National Energy Director of Cape Verde. So good afternoon now. Can you share with us which are the key intervention in the renewable energy sector of your country strategy that your country, have yielded the most rapid and widely felt impact to date?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. As you know, we are a small island country, so renewable energy since the beginning, at the early stage, was early 70s, was already considered the best option to explore. At that time, maybe with prohibitive cost, but we started at that time was already being in place of some experience. Right now, I would say that the key aspect for accelerating our energy transition and the use of renewable is something that have been mentioned by the IRENA representative, to have a very good planning exercise, a master plan for the electricity sector that can cope with the established vision, since we need to work with the long-term vision of what we want to achieve, have a clear goal set, but also a holistic approach and not a business as usual plan. Because if you want to go to a high level of renewable energy, depending on intermittent source of energy, you need to address not only how to deploy more capacities, but also how you will manage your grid with a high level of intermittency. So storage is part of this equation. Another key element is to have the right environment for business to be in place. So the capacity building and the institutional capacity, regulatory and clear procedures for orderly introducing the new capacities in the grid is important, including for distributed generation. I understand that is more the focus of these talks. The distributed generation can play a big role, an important one in this case. Maybe not in a small country as us. We have about 8 mini grids, But we are promoting also the decentralized generation, even in the grid-connected households and communities. There are limits, technical limits also that need to be addressed. So you need the right way to control the systems. But for the mini grids, if I can share in terms of our experience of running these mini grids, the initial challenge was to mobilize the resources to build them as a public initiative, because they are still very expensive if they are relying on storage and batteries. We have some of this situation. And then when it comes to the operational part, it is important also to make sure that it's not only about deploying the project, but have them well maintained, and to practice a price that can be affordable for the consumers that are mostly in the case in mostly the poor people. So our debate at this point, and I think this can apply to other systems, is that despite the fact that these small systems are not grid connected, we can have, and this is a discussion ongoing in the country right now, have these consumers to benefit from the same tariff as the conventional consumers in the grid, and have somehow a unified tariff in the country that take into account these extra costs, and it is diluted in the whole system. This, I think, is something very important, and the interconnection and have a very robust system with well-maintained and sustainable from the point of view of the economics and financial viability of the system are also important. I don't know.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Evora. Indeed, Cape Verde has been an example, if I can say so, in this acceleration towards renewable energy. So thank you very much for your presentation and testimony. And I would like now to move on to Mr. Amar Inmandar, the founder of Kawi Safi. Amar, you run a renewable energy investment facility in Africa, aiming to get renewable energy to more than 10 million low-income people in East Africa. The Dalberg report speaks to the need for a climate finance accelerator. What would this need to do in your view? And also, how can green deal making being accelerated in the next, let's say, 9 to 10 years?
Fabulous, Astria. Thank you so much for the invitation. I hope you can all hear me. And I just wanted to remark on the extraordinary speakers that have gone before us, the really great crowd of people. Many of the points, I'm kind of going through my notes, checking off many of the points that, that folks are making, and I couldn't agree more. Let's just think in terms of the accelerator piece, which you've asked me to speak about. Yes, I work with a fund called Kawi Safi. We're part of the Acumen family that's been investing in early stage businesses in Africa going back more than 20 years. In the last few years, we've really focused in on the energy piece and the distributed renewable energy piece. And as you say, we've had some successes down the tracks, learned some lessons down the tracks, and I hope to share some of those with the audience today. First of all, just in terms of the big picture pieces, James from Dalberg makes some really great points, and we love this report, by the way. We think it's a terrific report, and it says a lot to our audiences and to those that we speak with every day. There's a lot of truth here, and it has a lot of resonance. We love the idea of Africa as a leader, not as a follower. We're based out of Nairobi. We invest in businesses that work in Africa, for Africans, with Africans. And we see the delivery on the ground, and we want to accelerate that delivery. So you've asked us about acceleration. One of the big headlines I'd give back to this audience is think not of the accelerator as a single competing body that we should set up and run separately out there. Think of acceleration at a country level. We've all been talking about this in the last 5 or 6 conversations we've just had. Think of what we can do as a country to accelerate investment and accelerate our goals to SDG 7, and think, who do we have as allies and what does acceleration mean in that context? And let me just give a little tiny bit of context to that. So, yeah, we need something like $50 billion a year. I mean, there are different numbers that are bandied about by different entities, but let's pick that number. And as Rockefeller, we were just hearing talk about $1 billion being committed in the space. That's an extraordinary amount of capital. We need to multiply that capital up, as Joseph says, many, many times, maybe 50 times if you're being optimistic. But there are lots of reasons for us to be optimistic. And I think we should be optimistic sitting here and now in this space as we start to evolve from COVID. There's been a 90% decline in costs. I think Samir talked about that in terms of PV. Storage costs are coming down. Technology is really driving. You heard Nithyo, head out Nithyo, talk about mobile money. Nigel, you mentioned mobile money as well. It's a technology-driven sector that James talks about. And this idea of radical affordability is really starting to happen. So we are at a leapfrog moment where energy is radically affordable compared to what it was just 5 years ago or even a decade ago. Just the DRE sector itself has employed more than 350,000 people on the continent. It's brought 500,000 people into power. There's so much to celebrate in terms of success here. And just our own fund, the Kawisafi Fund, leveraged public capital up 22 times. So for every $1 of public capital, we brought in $22 to magnify that effect into investment into the ecosystem. And countries like Kenya that have embarked upon putting distributed renewable power at the heart of their policies have seen already a jump of something like 20% on the number of people that have access to power when you start counting these smaller systems at the residential and at the small business level. But there's lots of capital on the sidelines. We've seen this big transition globally toward renewable power, people wanting to decarbonize their portfolios, but it doesn't seem to stick for some reason, and we don't seem to be able to get enough of it into Africa. Let me give you a couple of very small examples. We celebrated, I think 2019, we celebrated $1 billion of private equity venture capital coming into Africa, and we thought $1 billion was a great number. We looked across the ocean and we saw that $80 billion a year finds its way into venture capital in Northern California, just Northern California. And that in Africa, there was 139 deals that involved private and venture capital, 139. In the United States, it's about 10,500. We're doing great work, and I think as a continent we're doing extraordinary things, but there's a big way to go, and we need to work hard to get this acceleration concept to happen. So what's holding us back? I think it's 3 things. I think what we hear as we raise capital in this market, as I say, we're very focused on the distributed renewables in Africa. We get pushback on 3 basic things. 1, the deals that we're presenting to folks are too small. 2, the risks are just too high. And 3, the returns are too low. Sounds obvious, the risks are too high, the returns are too low, the deals are too small. We hear that over and over again, but we think that there are real opportunities here, and we can show that we can make a difference by changing some of that narrative. And sitting behind some of that narrative is that the technology trends that James and the Dalberg study have started to point out, that it is rational and economically rational to do this. We looked at a whole bunch of accelerators and aggregators in this market and said, what works, what doesn't work, and we typically finding 3 or 4 things. First, it's very easy to crowd out capital. You put that question, Astria, to Joseph at Rockefeller. It's very easy to crowd out the capital. Let's come with public capital, but we crowd out private capital. It's very easy to reinvent the wheel, to fragment and have yet another institution. It's very easy to think that there's a magic bullet. One accelerator will fix all of the solutions. And it's very easy to overthink it and to say, well, we as the accelerator have the answers, we can do it. Nobody else gets to use it. I would suggest that we could think about accelerators in a slightly different way. And I would really focus on 4 things, just to close out this conversation on my side. 4 things for us to really focus on. First is to recognize the diversity of businesses out there. There's some culture like Samir's business. There are much bigger businesses and much smaller businesses, and each of them needs different kinds of capital. So our accelerators need to be thinking, are we really talking about innovating those very early stage businesses, or are we thinking about growing and scaling much later stage businesses, because each of them has different capital requirements. I think the key thing here is to recognize that for each of the countries that we're talking about sitting around this table in Africa, there is already an ecosystem of African and other investors and operators and banks and aggregators, investment funds, like Sunfunder, like Responsibility, like Nithio, like ourselves at Kawisafi, like Rockefeller, that are doing this work and play the role of accelerators. Can we help to build some coherence in those accelerators about the role that, for example, concessional capital and DFIs could play to partner up with those sources of capital and leverage themselves together towards an outcomes? Can we agree on what those outcomes are? So can we strip away the procedural and the complex diligence requirements that we think we need in so many different ways, look at the existing community of investors, the Sun Funders, the Rockefellers, and say, you guys know this market, you're operating in this market. Can we strip some of that away and talk about what are the outcomes that we want to achieve with our dollars? Do we want to multiply it with other people's capital? Do we have impact metrics, for example, people impacted or CO2 offset that we can talk about that helps to crowd ourselves around discrete goals? And can we also then third kind of huddle around as countries what makes it easier to run businesses and do business in the energy space? So many of us in the last couple of talks have just talked about the regulatory requirements, regulatory simplicity. Some countries sitting around this table have very simple one-stop shops to allow for permitting of new startups and for businesses challenging and pushing into the space. So we would love to see that. We'd love to see this idea of more coherence around acceleration. We think there's some basic principles here that we can talk about that can help to articulate and bring people together, really drive towards bringing capital to these markets, which is so desperately needed. Just to kind of tag off, it's easier to raise capital in this crazy world we live in for an app like Angry Birds or Cut the Rope than it is to raise capital for a company like Samir's that will drive water and power to rural communities in Africa and serve those that need it the most. That seems crazy to us. And I think we have a real opportunity through this acceleration framework to really drive towards this idea of a just, inclusive, low-carbon economy that James and others talk about in the Dalberg piece. So I hope that gives some food for thought in terms of some principles around acceleration. And thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you all.
Thank you very much, Amar. I couldn't agree more on the importance to size the financing instrument and maybe through this accelerator to the specific capital requirements based on each company's size and development stage. So that's very crucial. Thank you very much for mentioning that, among other great comments. So now I would like to move on to Mr. Damiano Namuera, Head of Renewable Energy Department at the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources of Mozambique, to tell us a bit more about the country strategy when it comes to access and development of renewable energies. Mr. Namuera, the floor is yours.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Sorry, I will speak in Portuguese. I can explain more about our country's strategy of our countries.
Yes, of course. Feel free to express yourself in Portuguese. The session is translated.
Muito obrigado. Bom, primeiro deixa explicar que a visão do governo sobre o setor de energia consiste em melhorar continuamente a regulamentação e o desempenho da indústria de fornecimento da própria eletricidade, por forma a responder às necessidades de desenvolvimento econômico e social sustentável. Logo muito cedo, nós notamos que a parte das energias renováveis que vinha nas nossas legislação era, era muito restrita e não abordava muito a questão de energias renováveis. Então, houve necessidade de trazermos aquilo que é legislação sobre energias renováveis ao setor de energias renováveis. Sendo assim, logo aprovamos uma política sobre energias renováveis para poder trazer mais investimento no setor de energias renováveis. A nossa política e estratégia de energias renováveis, ele traz uma abordagem em que o aproveitamento de energias renováveis não pode ser só feita com o governo, mas é preciso ter como um braço de apoio o privado. Isso vem lá muito bem destacado nas nossas políticas e estratégias de energias renováveis. Mas era preciso trazer ainda mais abertura naquilo que é a legislação para investimento na área de energias renováveis. Recentemente, em 2018, aprovamos um plano diretor integrado de eletricidade, em que dá uma visão em termos de infraestruturas, o que é que nós temos para poder aceitar as energias solar, eólica, que capacidade é que nós temos em termos dessas infraestruturas. E também, junto a isso, trazer num horizonte até 2030 ou 40, até 2043, em termos de geração, o que é que nós podemos gerar até 2043. Mas era preciso também que o mercado do setor de energias fosse mais transparente. E para isso nós criamos aquilo que é o regulador de energia, para poder a questão do negócio de energias renováveis fluir de uma forma transparente dentro do país. Mas nós não paramos por aí. Em 2013 também criamos um Atlas de energias renováveis. O Atlas de energias renováveis, ele traz em termos de recursos, o que é que nós temos em termos de recurso solar, eólico, hídrico e mesmo geotérmico ou oceânico, o que é que nós podemos explorar, o que é que nós temos para o privado explorar, ou mesmo o próprio explorar para explorar em termos de energias renováveis. Não paramos para aí com os parceiros, de uma forma a mostrar que é possível. Criamos aqui também uma fábrica de painéis solares para mostrar à população que ali tem uns painéis que é possível usar para os projetos. Recentemente, nós elaboramos aquilo que é a Estratégia Nacional de Eletrificação. Okay? Essa Estratégia Nacional de Eletrificação, ela vai até um período 2030, e com o objetivo de levar a energia a todos os moçambicanos, tendo em conta os consumidores, tanto comerciais como sociais, dentro, assim como fora da rede elétrica, assim nas zonas rurais, zonas urbanas, periurbanas, para toda a população. E o plano defende a entrada de operadores privados na eletrificação. Já podemos ter os operadores privados na eletrificação, porque a nossa ideia aqui é abrir o mercado para a entrada do setor privado, para, junto com o governo, levar a energia ao lugar mais longínquo de Moçambique. Bom, esse objetivo de levar a energia até ao lugar mais longínquo, a população, está alinhado com aquilo que é o programa quinquenal do próprio governo moçambicano. E também está alinhado com a Agenda de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, que orienta que todos os países, para que nos próximos 12, 13, 14 anos, assegurem um acesso confiável, sustentável, assim como moderno, e também a um preço sustentável de energia. Portanto, isso está alinhado com a nossa estratégia está alinhada com essas diretrizes. Portanto, o programa Energia para Todos, como referi antes, contempla também uma abordagem de expansão da rede elétrica nacional, assim como está contemplada por investimentos em sistemas isolados em áreas fora da rede elétrica nacional. Portanto, ele tem esses dois complementos na estratégia. Portanto, há uma coisa muito importante para que a gente consiga chegar ao desenvolvimento sustentável e de uma forma ambientalmente sustentável. A própria contribuição das energias renováveis para a meta de acesso universal é fundamental nas nossas estratégias, pois isso permite a instalação em tempo útil das centrais, tanto solares, eólicas, de média escala, em locais próximos dos centros de carga. E o investimento público-privado em novas centrais de infraestruturas, geração, foi mais ou menos dentro daquilo que é o plano diretor entregado, avaliado em 600 megawatts, pelo menos até 2030, que terá uma contribuição dessas energias renováveis. Portanto, é nisso que o governo moçambicano está a trabalhar para poder levar a energia à população até o local mais longínquo de Moçambique e de uma forma sustentável, trazendo as energias renováveis para aquilo que é o mercado de energia em Moçambique. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Thank you very much, Mr. Namuera, for this presentation, a very ambitious strategy plan for towards 2030. And we keep in mind, of course, the very fast path in which Mozambique is moving toward this agenda, including in the national strategy, the global agenda for climate change. So thank you very much. So now, last but not least, we are moving to Naomi Wagura, who's from SE4All. Naomi, SE4All is working on developing energy compacts at a country level in Africa, and we look forward to seeing this being launched shortly. So can you tell us a bit more about those compacts, what they are, and how they are going to contribute to move towards those objectives?
Thank you, Astria. And I'm happy to be speaking last but not least. And all the great points that have already been covered today. I think it's been very encouraging to hear the same things reiterated that most of us know, but it's always good to hear them again because it kind of focuses us on what the actual challenges in terms of climate, in terms of energy access and energy transition in Africa. So just as a way of background, and I'm going to try and keep this brief because we are over by quite a bit. So SE4All is working on the high-level dialogue on energy, which is the first coming together at the high-level, political high-level in 40 years to discuss energy matters at the UN level. And this is going to be held in September 2021. And a major outcome of this high-level dialogue on energy are these energy compacts that SE4All and other partners that are working on encouraging different stakeholders to develop. So this is national governments, subnational governments, private sector companies, development institutions, and civil society organizations. So the encouragement here is to develop something that is very ambitious. So step up your ambition because as we've heard over and over again, we are off track. So make it ambitious, make sure that it's inclusive and just. And that's something that we've had over and over again, but it's important to center people in all policy making, but also in plans from private sector and civil society organizations, because at the end of the day, all these plans are about people. So make it inclusive, and then make sure that there are actionable steps, and that those steps and all those things that you put in your energy compact, your commitments and the actions are based on data that is collected and is locally applicable for your country or whatever level that you're looking at, whether it's regional or whether it's country-wise or whether it's subnational. And companies like Nithio are collecting great data for different countries. So make sure that is integrated. So what an energy compact allows you to do is bring together all your climate, bring together your climate ambitions, bring together your energy access ambitions and all the other ambitions that you have and put them together in a place that is very highly visible. And this allows the private sector to get signals. So these are policy signals for governments that the private sector is not welcome to come into your country and help you meet the goals that you have. So in a nutshell, that's what energy compacts are. And that is how they're meant to drive us to bring in more private sector investment. And this is a live document, so they will be updated as better data becomes available, as we make progress, hopefully, and as things change on the ground, and as climate adaptation and climate mitigation, we meet some of those goals as well. So I'll leave it there, and thanks for having me on. Thanks, Astrid, back to you.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for this brief but very to the point intervention. So now I'm going to hand over to Nigel with this very difficult task of giving the closing remarks of what has been a very rich and intense conversation. So what is, Nigel, what is your vision for the future grid in Africa? And in relation to this, what renewable energy outcomes do you hope to see championed at COP27 that will be held next year in Africa?
Thanks, Astrid. What an amazing group of speakers. And you know, when you think of a vision, often you think of something that's really quite a long way from practice. But my overwhelming impression today is that the vision that I'm going to describe is something that is very tangible, because everybody's just talking in real practical details about what is being done and what can be done and what will be done. So my vision would be that, you know, all the countries and regions in the African continent develop their own pathways, but with some intelligent convergence on some of the approaches, like the accelerator idea, or like the way that we talk about outcomes. Because it seems to me that the business case and the climate case and the development case have all been made. It's really a question of building on the huge technology innovation. It's more about business model and financing innovation. So I'm really thrilled by the examples we've heard of ambition, vision, and innovation from the public sector, from whether it's from Malawi, Burkina Faso, Cape Verde, or Mozambique, from the kind of impact organizations, Rockefeller, Kawi Safi, SC for All, private sector, Sun Culture, Nithya. I've probably forgotten someone. But my vision is that we can, as several have said, stop thinking about Africa as having to follow and think about Africa leapfrogging or leading along the pathway which James has painted as part of that Dalberg analysis. To deliver that kind of leapfrog which Jean-Paul called for right at the beginning, and the transformations which I think Pasi defined as delivering a vibrant, resilient, and secure future for everybody, or Sifo talked about the goal of middle income status. These all seem to me realistic visions, but it's also clear that partners in the investment community are going to be key, and that to get that right, as Asami, Rito, and Hella all said, planning's got to turn into policies which encourage that investment. I really see more and more the leveraging more private sector funds as a key part of that. You know, with Mark Carney, we've launched the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and Shamira Wickramanayake, who's the CEO of Macquarie, is leading us a work stream looking at how to mobilize more private finance into emerging and developing economies. So it's really encouraging to hear a lot of the innovation being talked about by the speakers today being focused on just that. I'm sure that we're going to see, we've talked mostly about energy, but of course it's the productive uses in areas like green hydrogen and green fertilizers, green steel. You know, we know that some countries in Africa are going to have the possibility of becoming net clean power exporters in the form of power and or green hydrogen. So it's great to hear this really strong vision of the African Union that Crispin laid out. And also this idea of the corridor approach and then the last mile, getting to rural areas in particular. I think, you know, Samir's example is particularly impressive of the way that access to these new technologies improves economic resilience. I think he said that 90% of Sun Culture's farmer clients saw improved economic outcomes in a very challenging agricultural year where 90% of African farmers actually saw deterioration. So this is the time to move from ambition to action. And we know COP26 is going to be the first COP that's really focused on action. I think we can make COP27 the African action COP. So we build on that this year to see continued acceleration. We know that the transition brings huge developmental benefits, and that's going to be key to the development of a zero carbon resilient African future. So I expect COP26 to be the beginning of this demonstration of a more confident African set of initiatives, not one overarching, but a set of initiatives which are all learning from each other, such as the one laid out by Joseph that leverages both philanthropic and public finance to deliver the very large amounts of private finance that are going to be needed. And I'm really excited to have a chance to partner with whichever country in Africa is hosting COP27 next year, and with all of you to make sure that we are collectively demonstrating that Africa doesn't have to be a follower, but it can be a leader, as Amar said. And let me finish there. Astria, huge thanks to you for keeping us moving along. So much to pack in, and thanks to the High Level Champions team, to IRENA, the African Climate Fund, Dalberg, and UNECA for hosting this. I leave really encouraged and enthused that the next 3 months and the next 15 months and the next 10 years can be really all about accelerating action towards a thriving zero carbon future for all the citizens of the African continent. Thank you, Astria.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists for those great intervention. We are really in this mindset, if I can say so, to go from thinking to action. So I think this sum up well what the mindset of this panel. Thank you very much. So especially to the hundreds of people who joined us today, and for those who stayed with us until now, even if we went a bit over time. But I think that every single word pronounced today by our panelists were relevant and worth it, so no regrets on our hand. So thank you so much for the host of this event, IRENA, and the UN high-level champions. I leave it there, and I hope to see you all soon for another high-level discussion like this one. Thank you very much.
Everyone, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, James.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.